the England Valley Storytellers monthly story swap meeting. My name is John St. Clair. I'm the leader of this group and your Zoom host. And tonight, I think we will start. We have four people who are in person and four people on Zoom. And I think we'll start maybe, if Ron, would you be willing to start? And we'll start here at the in-person. And you can stand over there and
figure out how to get the screen working.
yeah. Just that. So what? I think it's okay. I kind of like to have some air circulation.
I got something if you want.
I'd rather not.
Okay.
This way, the chair is kind of curved and it leaves a little air circulation so the computer.
Yeah, better on the computer.
So it doesn't.
Anyway, as I said earlier, I haven't really added many new stories in recent years. And of course, I have a vast repertoire and usually can come up with something anytime I'm asked. But I've been sort of thinking about the stories that are unique to me, stories that, as far as I know of, no one else tells. This one is based on Tolstoy, very, very loosely on Tolstoy, just the essential backward theme. And I haven't told it in quite some time. Rorschach's Land. Rorschach was in the forest gathering his weekly allotment of fallen wood when he heard a crack of a whip and a scream of a horse in pain. He worked his way through the woods and came to where the road was and saw that a young noble had driven his carriage off of the road and was now stuck in the mud and was beating the horse as if it were the horse's fault. He could never hope to own a horse, but he hated to see any animal abused. And so he went to the back of the wagon, undid his bundle of wood, put the sticks in front of the tire, added his own shoulder to it, and managed to get the carriage free. Of course, the young noble had no words for him, but as he pulled away, he threw something over his shoulder. Rorschach gathered his wood, for without it his family would be cold this week, and then he went looking for whatever the man had thrown. It turned out to be a purse, and when he got back to his little shack and opened it, it had gold in it. His wife said, Rorschach, Rorschach, this is enough money that the children could go to school. They might have a better life than we've been able to give or our parents were able to have. That is a wonderful thing to happen. He said, no, I shall have land of my own. At that time, land was in the hands of nobles only, and peasants could never get anything of their own. Rorschach, how could that be? How could that be? I have a plan. I shall go see the young countess. Hey. The next morning, wearing clothes he only wore at Christmas and Easter, he approached the young, very young countess. Her husband, the count, had died recently, and she was now finding herself with a vast estate that she was responsible for, and not a whole lot of background in managing things. And he went to her and said, Madam, I have money. I would like to buy a chunk of the swamp and the hill next to it. It's all stony, and all it ever does is flood and create problems, but I would like to buy that from you. She saw no reason to refuse. And so he bought a solid stone rock, a hill, and some low-lying swampland. His neighbors laughed at him, but he had it. He would go out and work in the countess's fields and do his job, and then as soon as work was over, he would go to the top of that stone mountain with hammer and chisel and pound on the stones and cast them down, to the base and then into the swampland. And as he did this, the hill shrunk A nice enclave was made in the middle of it, and his swampland began to be far less swampy. And with a few years of steady effort and some help from his now growing children, he now had a lovely vegetable garden and land of his own, and a tiny house he had built in that hollow that was not always comfortable, but was at least truly their own. And life seemed. But the Countess married, and the noble who had taken from her was determined that he could not have Russia, living in land of his own, and right in the middle of his own holdings, and he kept offering to buy the land at ever greater prices. But Russia had land of his own, and that was his dream. And so he resisted offer after offer, and life got ever more uncomfortable. One day, though, a horse trader came through. Rorschach had no use for a horse, but he greeted the stranger and talked to him, and he found out that a near Kiev, an estate had fallen to the ground, to the czars, and they were going to allow people to buy plots of land of their own. This was a great thing. He went to the count who had wanted his property and said, "Your last price was such and so. If you will increase that by 20%, I think we shall accept the deal." Of course, the man was happy to get his land back. And he gathered his children, and his wife, and he bought a horse from the horse trader, and they went off to the far city of Kiev, where indeed they were able to buy a nice plot of land, and they began to farm. And they were industrious people, and they knew how to get things done. What's more, Rorschach found that he had a talent for horses. And so he bought more horses from the horse trader and had a nice herd and was selling horses to people that needed horses. And life was good. But he always wanted more land. And there was no more for sale nearby. This desire grew upon him as their wealth grew, and he didn't know what to do about it. And one day, one of the horse traders came back through, buying some horses from it, and said, "I've heard that in the land of the Cossacks, you can get vast tracts of land for nothing but trade goods, trinkets, and pretty items that they don't have themselves." Well, of course, Rorschach's face broke into a radiant smile, and he took his two best horses and his most loyal worker and said, "I shall go to the land of the Cossacks. We shall have things to trade, and I shall get a vast tract of land." And so they rode through known places and unknown places, and then out into the great, vast spring steppes. And there was nothing there. And they thought, "There are no Cossacks, there's nothing here. We may have to just give up for lack of food and head back." But as they got to that point where he was thinking about surrendering, suddenly there was thundering around them, Cossacks on horses. They cut a great circle around them. They rode around them with their fierce weapons showing. And suddenly, at a word from one of them, they all stopped and stood and stared at the strangers. And then one of them came forward. "What brings you to our land?" I understand that I can trade some of the things I have brought with me for a piece of land that I might bring and build my home on. "Let us see what you brought." He spread his wares before him, and the Cossack leader said, "Ah, Russia, you have enough there for a day of land. A day of land. At the top of this hill, there's a tall stone. Tomorrow morning, when the first beam of sunshine starts that rock, you may head out in any direction you wish. And as soon as you think you can't see where you were before, you can dig a marker, make a marker for yourself, and Okay, and you can do that as long as you want, as long as by the last beam of sunlight sinks behind the hill, you have brought yourself back to this stone. Well, of course, he was very excited. He waited impatiently through the night. Hey, the next morning, very cold yet. Hey, the Cossack said, go. And he set off immediately west. And he walked and he walked, and every once in a while he'd stop with the spade they'd given him and dig up a cairn of broken dirt that would stand for a while, and he could still see the one behind him. And he walked west for a while. And then, as the day grew a little later, he thought maybe it is time to turn off. And so he turned a little to the east and he started to make another big thing. And then eventually he turned back. It was getting very late in the day, and he was thinking I will have to head straight back to the hillock when he came upon a sudden ribbon in the ground, a narrow valley. And he looked down into it, and the whole bottom of that tiny narrow valley was swampland. And of course, it was surrounded by the rocks. And he thought, I must have this in my possession. I know just what to do with this kind of land. It is late. He hurried to where things closed off and he could cross over and got over the other side, and he ran along the valley and came back to where he was before, and then he headed off as fast as he could go toward the distant hill. And he got a ways from there, and he took the shovel itself and put it in the ground and threw a scarf around it, and then he went on. Hey, by now he could hear the people in the distance. He could see the sun was sinking. He began to run. His side was aching. His heart was breaking. He thought, I must reach the top of the hill in time. I must. Hey, as he went up the hill, Cossacks were all cheering for him. His servant was saying, you can do it, Cossack. You can do it. You can get there. Come on, let's go. And he put on a last burst of speed and jumped forward and touched the stone. A great cheer went up. And the Cossack leader said, oh, Cossack, you have won a great tract of land. Cossack. That last burst of speed had also burst his heart. He lay down, cold and still, next to the great stone. I left him there, your man, on the land that he had bought at such great price, said her servant. He's still there. It's ours if you want to do something with it. And she said, land. Would there ever have been enough land? I don't know, lady, said the servant. But at the end of the day, all she needed was a piece, 6 foot, 6 foot.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, so Nick, you said you had a story. Let's go to you next. And I'll turn the chair around so we can see you. Can you all see?
Yep.
Okay.
My problem with learning stories is almost the opposite of Ron's, because I'm constantly looking at stories, but it takes a while for a story to really grab me sometimes. And this one I found something like 30 years ago, but didn't tell it until a week and a half ago, because I told it down at the Sam Hinton Festival, and I will tell it for you tonight. It's an old Swedish story, and the title translates as the name Lindagold. Now, once there was a king who had suffered a great loss in his personal life, for both his wife and his child had perished. He had no heir. He had no wish to marry again and produce another heir, for he felt that life, or perhaps people, are like a beast with claws that tear out your heart. and he would not let anyone close to him again. In fact, he would not even let his own servants close to him. He insisted that they stay 2 arms lengths away from him, even when they were doing their jobs. When he was served dinner, he told the servants to serve it 2 arms lengths away from him, farther down the table, and that no one should touch him. His valet would prepare his clothes while the king was not in the room, and the king would return after the valet had left them there and put on his clothes himself. For no one would touch him, no one would tear out his heart again, no one would reach him with their claws. This went on for some time, and of course, the courtiers and the people of the kingdom were worried that there was no heir, and also that the king had faded away so much from the man that they had known and loved. Well, one day, the king had gone out walking off into the forest near the castle because there were no people there, none who could bother him, none who could harm him. And as he walked along, he heard a tiny scream and footfalls running toward him. And out of the brush, there came a little girl. She was very nice, and she had pretty golden hair, and she was panic-stricken. And she said, Sir, can you help me? There's a wolf chasing me." Well, no honorable king could refuse a request like that. And he said, "Stand behind me and I'll try to help you." And he drew out his sword, and sure enough, a wolf burst out of the underbrush and screeched to a stop, because this wolf had encountered men before and the sharp, hard, pointy things that they carried. And this man was a lot bigger and a lot more dangerous looking than the small child that it had been chasing. Well, the king waved his sword a bit in the wolf's face, and the wolf decided, "Yes, I think I will hunt somewhere else today," and ran off. Well, the king looked at the little girl and said, "Well, now you should be safe going home." And she said, "Oh, but I have to go back through the forest because my father is the miller and my mother makes wonderful bread with the flour the miller makes. And it would be great for me to show you the place where I live. And my mother would give you some nice white bread if you would come with me and guide me home." Well, the king said, "Oh, the wolf might be there in the forest still. Show me where you live, and I will help you. Lead the way, and I will follow right behind you." And the little girl said, "Well, it's kind of scary because of the wolf. And would it be all right if I held your hand and you guide me back through the forest that way?" And the king said, "Oh, no, no, no. I don't let people touch me. You see, they have terrible claws that I've been hurt by before." And the little girl looked at her hands and said, "Yes, my daddy is always complaining that I don't cut my nails short enough. But I'll tell you what, how about if I hold on to your tunic and you guide me through the forest that way? That way my fingernails won't scratch you, okay?" Well, this was not what the king wanted or what he would normally do, but it was a young child and one not likely to cause him harm. And so he allowed her to hold onto his tunic, and he marched through the forest with her and kept her happy and kept his sword out just in case, so that she wouldn't be frightened. And they walked until he could see the mill ahead by the river. And he said, "There you go. Now you can rejoin your parents." And she said, "But won't you come with me and have some bread? My mother bakes really great bread because she gets the best grain from my father." "No, no. Just go home and take care of yourself and don't go where the wolf can get you, all right?" "Well, if you won't come and visit me where I live, I want to come and visit you where you live. Where do you live?" "I live at the castle on the other side of the forest." "Okay, I'll find a way to get there without the wolf eating me, and I'll come visit you, all right?" And the king laughed and said, "But be very careful not to get eaten by a wolf. I would be very sad if you got eaten by a wolf on the way to visit me." "Oh, I'll be careful." And she went running back to her mother and explained that she'd been delayed in the forest, but a nice man had helped her. And she didn't tell her mother about the wolf because that would have made the mother very unhappy to almost lose her daughter. But the king, he walked home back to the castle and forgot about it because it was a little girl. She wasn't going to remember saying things like that. But just a couple of days later, he heard a commotion down by the castle gate. And there, arguing with the castle guards, was that same little girl. Well, he leaned out the window to hear what they were saying, and she was saying, yes, yes, Mr. Graybeard with the sword told me that I could come and visit him, and he said he lived here at the castle. And the guards were saying, what in the world are you talking about? Well, you have to let me in, or I won't be able to visit Mr. Graybeard with the sword. Go away, small child. Well, she did, only far enough to see where there was a different gate. And she went to the other gate, because castles usually have 2 or 3 ways into them if you know where to look. And she was the kind of inquisitive child who would look. And so she found the second gate, the one for people going in rather than big wagons and horses. And she went to that gate. And of course, the servant who was at that gate didn't want to let her in either. Well, finally, she figured out where the servant gate was. And she went around to this. Well, by that time, the king himself had decided maybe I ought to let her in. And he came down out of his tower and over to the gate where she was now arguing with one of the higher level servants about why she should be let in to see Mr. Graybeard with the sword. The king went up to the servant and said, I think she means me. And the servant was stunned because first, the king came down from the tower to see a little girl, and second, because the little girl had called the king such a disrespectful name, and the king didn't seem to be unhappy about it. But the servant opened the gate and let the little girl in, and she said, see, I promised I'd come to visit you. And the king said, yes, you've come to visit me. Come, let us sit and talk, and you can tell me all about your trip here and about the things that have happened since I last saw you. And they sat and they talked. The king showed her the fountain that was in the middle of the courtyard, and he walked her around to the different places in the castle. And finally he said, now you have to go home and be safe, right? And the little girl said, yes, yes, I'll go home and be safe. I called you Mr. Graybeard, but I don't think I told you what to call me. You should call me Linda Gold, because that's what my mother calls me. All right. And so the king said goodbye to little Linda Gold, and she went off back to her home, the mill. Well, a few days later, she came again, and this began to become a regular routine. And on the third trip, she even said, and I cut my nails really short this time, so I don't have claws. Okay, is that okay? And the king said, that's true, you don't have claws. It's just that I'm not very comfortable having people touch me because of some things that happened. It's nothing you can do anything about. And I will be your friend, but just take care of your nails and don't worry. And again, they talked. And every time she visited, they talked. And eventually, the king learned that she was a very smart little girl. It's just that she was a miller's daughter rather than a princess. And that was when it struck him. She didn't have to be just a miller's daughter. And so on that trip, he said to the little girl, the next time you come, would you bring your parents with you? Well, I'll try, but my father is so very busy. Tell them that somebody at the castle really wants to talk to both of them, and it's very important. Okay, I will do that. And she went home. And a couple of days later, on what would have been a day of rest for the miller and his wife, they came instead to the castle because they were very puzzled by the things that their daughter had told them, that she'd been going to the palace to visit a graybeard with a sword, and that he had asked for them to come and that it was very important. They didn't know any reason why a miller and his wife should have to come to the castle or why their daughter had been visiting someone at the castle. And so they were curious and came. Well, much to their surprise, when they got to the castle, they discovered that the man waiting for them was the king himself. This was unheard of, and they had no idea what this was about. And he said, "Please, come in, sit here by the fountain, and I would like to talk to you." And so they did. And he said, "I met your daughter some time ago when I was walking in the forest, and we've become friends. My own wife and my own child are no longer alive, and I have no one else to become my heir. But I have realized that your daughter is someone who loves to learn things and loves to meet people and loves to be good to people. And so I would like to bring her into the castle and teach her to become a princess so that she might become my heir and rule this kingdom after me." Well, the miller and his wife were stunned. No one had ever heard of anything like that happening, but they couldn't really say no. But still, they asked their daughter, "Would you like to live here at the castle?" And she said, "Well, not without you." And the king said, "Well, of course your parents can come and live here with you." And so the miller and his wife and little Linda Gold moved into the castle. And the king spent his remaining years teaching little Linda Gold about all the things that are needed to know to rule a kingdom. And so it was that when the king finally ended his days, little Linda Gold and her parents and all of the kingdom lived happily ever after because they had a knowledgeable and wise princess now who had been trained by a king who, even though he was in pain from having life tear his heart out, he taught her well and wisely. And so the next princess was named Linda Gold.
Be given remotely like that. It's a wonderful tale.
Yeah, it is. It really is unique.
Yeah.
Gorgeous, gorgeous story. Thank you for sharing that.
So what part of the world does that come from?
It's from Sweden, and I found it in one collection of stories many years ago, and all of the stories in that collection had some loose connection to the concept or items of gold. And that was not the story that I normally tell from those stories that I learned in that collection, but it's one that's kind of stuck with me, and it's like, eventually I should learn to tell that. So this is only the second time I've told it. I hope that worked.
It was wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Very beautiful, very beautiful.
Yeah, you make a really good little girl.
Okay.
Well, the idea of her being like that came from the story, and I just had to figure out how to convey it in a spoken form.
Did well.
Okay. I'm actually starting to get a little tired here. Does anybody else have a story? I don't think I'm going to share one after. Oh, Adrian, you want to tell yours?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, this is a story that I heard and I thought, oh, this is all right. You may not want to hear this if you're alone in the dark somewhere. So, so many of you have probably traveled to Hawaii and you've enjoyed, the scenic highways and such. And if you've been to Honolulu, you've probably no doubt heard of the Poly Highway. which takes travelers to the Pali Lookout. You probably even heard some of the, um, the folklore of, you can't travel with pork across the highway because there was a rift between the pig god and Pali oh, what's the not, Pele. And so, sometimes cars will stop dead, at the top of the road there if they've got pork in their car until they throw it out the way. I mean, just all sorts of legends and stuff. Well, I mean, this was a location, this Pali Lookout was the scene where there was an intense battle in the 17th century. And it's also been a place for lovers' trysts and subsequent suicides of unrequited love or betrayed lovers. Um, it's basically a piece of highway that's frequented by, who I mentioned before, the volcano goddess Pele, as well as Wahini, a grotesque sort of lizard-like creature with the ability to transform into a beautiful woman. So, some of you may have visited haunted Hawaii sites with a consummate guide, Kapanui, and it's his encounter at the Pali Lookout that I share with you as a bit of a cautionary tale with a twist. So many years ago, as a high schooler, Lopaka and his friends Sean and Ted decided it was a perfect time to cut school. And beautiful day. They ran through the drive-through to get those essential food supplies that high schoolers need. They picked up Ted's girlfriend, Tracy, and sort of headed out to the Hot Poly Highway to the lookout. While Ted and Tracy began making out, Sean and Lopaka excused themselves and went walking toward the lookout point. And that's when they saw sort of this lower path, which led further down. So they decided to follow that just to see how far it went. The ginger plants were in full bloom at almost 7 feet tall, and the fragrance filled the air, and the winds were strong. And the further they walked, they were able to look over the edge and saw there was no one on the road below. The further they walked out, they could hear the wind roaring as the leeward and the windward winds met at the peak of this lookout. They came around a bend in the path, and suddenly all sounds stopped. The wind was still moving the trees and the leaves, but there was no sound, no birds. Looking out toward the water, that's when they heard the voice of a girl, right around their age, calling out Sean's name. Sean? 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 Well, Lopaka and Sean looked at each other and looked around. And then the voice went crazy. It began shouting Sean's name in rapid succession. Sean, 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 Sean. And it grew to a frenzied pitch that truly sounded unhinged. Did you hear that? They asked each other simultaneously. Oh, there was dead silence. All of a sudden, all the noise was gone. And then they heard the girl's voice say just once, Lopaka. How did this disembodied voice know our names? Sean stood with his back to the ocean, facing Lopaka, whose back was to the path behind them. And in that moment, Sean's chin went down, his shoulders hunched, and then he football tackled Lopaka out of the way, knocking him to the ground, and took off running. Picking himself up from the ground, Lopaka was too scared to be hurt, even though he was scraped up and bleeding. He ran after Sean, and when he caught up with him, they got into a big fight. Lopaka was not so much hurt as he felt betrayed. Sean had left him behind. Well, Ted disentangled himself from Tracy and came over and broke up the fight. And needless to say, on the way home, the two shaken boys really didn't say much to each other. Their friendship grew distant, and they went their separate ways until March 2006, which was nearly 26 years after this encounter at the lookout. Lopaka got a call one afternoon. The caller ID said unknown. And as he answered it, the voice on the other side said, "This is Sean." And after a pause, Lopaka replied, "Dude, where have you been? I tried contacting you years ago, but you just fell off the map. What's up, man? Take this address down, he monotoned. Meet me tomorrow at noon. Then he hung up. Well, the address was for a home that Sean had grown up in, and Lopaka had spent a lot of time there. At the specified time the next day, Lopaka arrived. Sean led him to an enclosed patio. Sean turned on the interior fluorescent lights, you know, the ones that sort of crackle and blink before they go on all the way. And he didn't bother getting up to offer his guest a, "Hey, man, how you doing? Been a long time no see." Instead, he just gestured to a chair that wasn't far from him. He pulled up close, or Lopaka pulled up closer to Sean, and Sean didn't seem to be bothered by him getting closer, but he looks at him, he said, "Do you remember that day we went to the Poly and walked down that empty road?" "Yeah," said Lopaka. "Remember how we heard the voice call my name and then it called your name?" He looked at Lopaka now for some kind of confirmation. "Yeah," said Lopaka, "I remember. And I knocked you down and ran away. You remember that?" He was pressing now. "Yes." Lopaka was irritated now with all the questions and no acknowledgement of their past as high school classmates and friends. "What's this all about, man?" "You never wondered why I knocked you down." Sean's tone softened. "All the time." Lopaka's tone matched Sean's now. "When the voice called your name, a Hawaiian girl appeared from behind you with pale skin and long black hair. She was going every detail. He was going over every detail so he wouldn't miss anything. She didn't have any clothes on, and her hands were wrapped around your shoulders. She was looking at you like a meal." She looked at me, and her eyes rolled over black, and a black forked tongue came out of her mouth. So when I pushed you out of the way, the spirit of that Hawaiian girl jumped on me, and she's been with me ever since. What? Lopaka couldn't believe that Sean had brought him here for this, to tell him this far-fetched story. Sean continued, "The entire week after we went to Poly, that Hawaiian girl's spirit would appear outside my bedroom window, knocking on the glass again and again. Every time I'd open the window, she would point at the screen. She wanted me to let her in, and I always shook my head no. Finally, at the end of the week, when she appeared outside the window, demanding to be let in, and I refused her again, she took her finger and rubbed it across the screen slowly, and then the hook that held the screen to the window came undone. She pulled the screen back and climbed in. That's the last thing I remember," Sean said. "I woke up and it was morning, but I haven't been the same since." The silence allowed Lopaka a second or more to take in everything Sean had said. Looking carefully at Sean, he didn't know how he'd missed it. If what he said was true, this thing with the Hawaiian girl's ghost or spirit really screwed up his life. It showed on his face. "Why tell me now, after all these years?" he asked him. "Do you see how well lit this patio is?" Sean asked without answering the question. "Yeah," Lopaka nodded. "But do you see that corner behind me to the right? How it's dark, even though there's a light shining on it?" He pointed with his thumb in that direction. "Yeah, that is strange. What is that?" "That's her," he said. "She's still with me. She never left. You see, you've changed. You're not the same person you were back in high school, especially since that day. Me, I'm still Sean Takeda from March 1980. She won't let me be anything but that." Sean put his head down, hiding his face. He waved goodbye and gestured for Lopaka to leave, half unsure at first. That dark, lingering presence in the corner, well, He didn't want to stay any longer than he had to. Later, as Lopaka asked his mother about this, she smiled and said it was a Moawaini there to pull a lover into the sea with her. She could have taken me, Lopaka exclaimed. His mother smiled. If it was your time, you would not still be here. 10 years later, in 2016, Lopaka drove by Sean's house, but it was gone. With the new house standing on top of the foundation of what was once Sean's boyhood domicile, he couldn't help but wonder if the spirit or ghost of the Hawaiian girl from Pali went with Sean, or if she decided to stay where she was. Hawaii is a small community. If anything, word will get around, and we'll know either way.
Yeah, I did turn on my light in this room. Just in case, just in case.
I don't know, Elizabeth. What's that shadow in the corner? No.
Is that, yeah.
Well, that one side of the bookshelf isn't very well lit now, is it?
Yeah, right. Oh, anyway, hope you enjoyed that. You can go online and hear him tell it, and oh my gosh, he's just a master storyteller. He does stories of haunted Hawaii and takes people around and shares these things. I just think, whew, yeah.
Who does this?
Lopaka Kapanoi.
Okay.
Yeah, if you look up haunted Hawaii, you'll see him and the various tours that he'll do through Hawaii and places he'll go that are kind of known to be haunted.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have stories? I think if not, I'm going to end the recording.
Okay, cool.
Wait.